Pokemon. Now let's get going with the Aether Paradise arc. I'm kidding, it's not really an arc yet. So, Gladion wouldn't participate. Neither would Lily. Lily and Gladion would just go their own way. They'd visit Aether Paradise. They'd go and meet Lucamine, all that crap. So, when that happens and the Ultra Beast comes, they're like, shit, there's an Ultra Beast! So he says, alright, Riolu, I choose you! Riolu comes out and he says, Ice Punch! It's a once, send it back a little bit, then Riolu's hit by a giant Venoshock. But then Riolu starts glowing blue. Because the Nihilego won't stop hitting it with it. And then it goes, and turns into a Lucario. And then he breaks through it because it doesn't really affect him, and he says, alright, Lucario, Aura Sphere! He creates an Aura Sphere and shoots it at Nihilego, knocking it back. And then he says, Hadoran! Knocking it out, finally, sending it back to where it came from. And he's like, well, that was easy. A little bit too easy. They leave Aether Paradise, head into Ula Ula Island. Let me give a level recap. Torracat is level 32. Lucario is about level 32 as well. Everyone's level 32. Let me give a team recap. We got Torracat, just saying. Dusklight is now a Dusk Lycanroc. There's Frogadier, Dusk Lycanroc, Torracat, and Lucario. Pretty stacked team. So he'd basically head all the way to Ula Ula and go train for a while. He went to Melee Garden to go train and also meet up with Kikubi. He met up, blah 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 blah. Then he went to go train for a long damn time. Training for about 5 hours, I'd say. A solid 5 hours, coming out with his team. Okay, I'm kidding, he's not there for 5 hours, he's there for like 20 minutes. Torracat level 33, everyone else is level 33. So moving on to the next one, the trial. So I don't really know what happens in this, blah blah blah. Move on to the electric trial. So basically, it'd start off with them going, and he'd catch all the Charjabug, and then after that, he would do the trial. It'd be Totem Togedemaru. When he'd do that, Torracat is struggling to get back up. He keeps on using Flame Charge to ram into it to defeat it. And then he says, out of nowhere, he says, Flame Charge! And hits Togedemaru back, but then Togedemaru goes and zing-zaps it. Then he uses Thunderbolt, shocking it for a while. And then Litten says, nah! And turns into Incineroar. And he says, cool, Incineroar. And he says, Darkest Lariat, go! He spins around and clobbers his face. And then he says, let's go! Zenith on my mind, body, and spirit, like the great mountain of Akala. Become a raging fire and burn! Inferno Overdrive! Defeating Totem Togedemaru, and he's like, yes, Electrium Z! Out of nowhere, a blue, black, and yellow blue lightning just blitzes past me. He's like, whoa! And then he says, Zeraora. He sees Zeraora again. He walks down, and then he goes to train for a couple of more minutes. And yeah, so basically everyone's at level 35. So basically he'd go back to Melee Garden, and he'd see Guzma. And then he says, Guzma's on his island challenge, and he's doing very good. He's like, well, I'll battle this kid to see if he's even close to good. Probably trash. So when the battle starts, he says, alright, Frogadier! So immediately he'd say, Frogadier, use cut! When he's about to say cut, he says, first impression. He'd rush over and slam Frogadier and hit Frogadier, sending it back to the Melee Garden wall, and he says, shoot! And then he's like, Water Pulse! Frogadier would create it and yeet it towards them. Hitting Golisopod, but it's shown that he's cut it in half. And he's like, Kagabushi! Creating 10 clones. Then he says, double, alright, Water Pulse! They all start eating it. Out of nowhere, Gillespie appears right in front of it and stabs Frogadier, then starts beating it down, defeating it. And then he goes, Frogadier! And then he turns into the ultimate, he turns into Greninja. He goes, Frogadier! And then he turns into Greninja. So when they start battling, it goes first impression. It goes emergency exit, and Ariados comes out, and he's like, alright, here we go, Aerial Ace, Greninja! Greninja would immediately kick it, and start punching it a little bit, then punching it back, defeating the Ariados. Then, Greninja would be surrounded by water, and then their eyes start to glow red, both Christian and Greninja. They're like, ah! And they'd immediately go Battle Bond, not full Battle Bond, the Battle Bond that Ash had when he first got it. He's like, alright. He's like, what the heck is this? And he's like, go, Golisopod! Golisopod! And he'd say, Greninja, cut! Greninja would cut, doing decent, and then he'd say, Aerial Ace! Defeating Golisopod right there. And Greninja would de-transform, and this is Black Greninja, Black and Red Greninja. He's like, whoa, that was awesome! I think I want to go train to master that. He's like, woohoo! Then he says, here's an Insinium Z. He's like, cool. So basically, he would go and say, nice, an Insinium Z. Let's head to the Ghost. So immediately, he'd walk down, and he'd go down the trainer road, training super duper hard. So he'd be pretty much now let's give it another team recap. So, he immediately after, he says, alright, let's see what we can do. So immediately, he finds about his levels halfway when he's done. He finds a Roto XP boost, and that Roto XP boost comes in handy because all his Pokemon turn into level 40s, level 39s. So when it happens, basically moving on to the trial. So basically, they'd actually get to this Aether house, and then blah 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 blah. Christian would go take the trial. He'd come back and say, alright, let's do this trial against Mimikyu. So he walks in with a smile on his face. He's like, easy. He says, alright, you ready? When the Mimikyu shows up, he's like, alright, this should be pretty hard. This is a strong totem I've heard. Then he says, let's go! Go, Greninja! We've been training a little bit, so we can do this now! And then he'd go into Battle Bond. Not full Battle Bond, he could just master the normal form. He says, Aerial Ace! Kicking it. But the decoy wears off and he's like, Water Shuriken! A giant Water Shuriken comes and slams right into Mimikyu. He shows 3 more, knocking Mimikyu back. And then Mimikyu uses a Play Rough. Greninja dodges and then he says, Aerial Ace! Kneeing it. Then kicking it down. Then doing a heel kick. Knocking out the Mimikyu, and he's like, alright Greninja, let's go! But then the Mimikyu would get right back up and he'd say, double team! Greninja would use double team, making a couple thousand clones, and then he'd say, alright, this seems a little overpowered, but I don't care! Aerial Ace! So 1,000 Aerial Aces would come and knock out the Mimikyu. I will be right back. Oh shoot, my controller's gonna die. Whatever, this is gonna be the last part for today, and tomorrow I'll upload the finale. Actually, there's gonna be like 5 more parts to this, because I want to make it a longer what if. So basically, this would be a pretty interesting part. So when they headed immediately, they break in, they're like, bust in the door! Bust in the door! So when he does, he defeats the Mimikyu finally, with Greninja ready, but then Greninja transforms. The Water Shuriken on his back and just standing there without the watery aura, and he's like, alright, that is so cool. So then he grabs the Greninja. Him and Greninja blitz over. Well, Christian can't really run that fast. His speed stat is like 25, because he's a human. So when he runs, he's like, "All right, Greninja, let's go." So they run, and they pretty much make it there in about 10 seconds. So when they make it, they're like, Team Skull. So immediately he send out 3 Pokemon, and he's like, "Alright, you wanna go?" He says, "Greninja, Water Shuriken on the 2 Salandits." Greninja! Beating the first one, he's like, "Alright, this should be pretty fun." Aerial Ace on the other. Greninja would blitz and knee that Salandit in the stomach, then kicking it away, knocking that one out too. Say, "Oh, how cute, a Salazzle." He says, "Water Shuriken!" He'd do that, and the flamethrower would actually cut through it, and he'd say, "Well, that's a pretty good one." Aerial Ace! Greninja would punch it, but then they start clashing, and he'd be like, "Alright, here we go! Water Shuriken!" He'd create a ginormous Water Shuriken, throwing it, exploding, and defeating the Salazzle. Finally defeating it. So basically, he would pretty much destroy it. So then they also kidnapped Lily and made her kidnap the young goose, blah 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 blah. Moving on to the Team Skull arc, where they take, so basically he'd go and wipe out most of the team Skull grunts, and then head to Guzma. He'd easily destroy Guzma with Incineroar. And then he'd say, "Alright, Incineroar, let's finish this house off." He wants to destroy the house, so there's no remains left of this house. He says, "Every single Team Skull member out of here." So immediately every Team Skull member would leave, and he's like, such a sad ending. And he'd say, "Do it." Incineroar refuses. He's like, "I don't want to destroy." And he's like, "Oh, well, whatever, let's leave." They head back, and Lily's kidnapped. So when Lily's kidnapped, he's like, Savenya Marisha. And then Gladion comes and he busts in the door. He's like, "What happened to Lily?" And he's like, "Lily's been kidnapped. We gotta head to Aether Foundation." He's like, "Alright, let's go." So immediately they'd run in. Let's give a quick team recap. They're all level 35. So basically when they go, he's like, "Alright." So immediately, they'd have a pretty good fight. So I'm pretty sure they'd head over to Aether Paradise. Christian would get his final grand trial, for his third to last grand trial. He'd say, "You can only defeat me with 1 Pokemon." And he's like, "Alright, go! Go, Lucario!" Sending out Lucario. And saying, "Let's go." He's like, "Oh, a fighting type. Go, Sableye." I'm kidding, he doesn't have one. I'm kidding, he does. He's like, "Go, Sableye." And he's like, "Alright, you wanna go?" And he says, "Alright, Lucario, Dragon Pulse." He shoots a Dragon Pulse, knocking out the Sableye in 1 shot because of how strong Lucario has gotten. And he's like, "Easy." He's like, "Wow, you got some skill, kid." So when he comes, he's like, "Alright, next attack." He says, "Hadodan! 3 of them!" He shoots 3 Hadodans, hitting Crocodile really, really hard. But it doesn't do enough, and he's like, "Alright, Power Up Punch!" He'd create a giant power fist and punch Crocodile, knocking it out. And then he'd say, "Alright." He'd say, "Go, Persian!" When Persian uses Black Hole Eclipse, he says, "Lucario, here's our exclusive Z-move." I'm gonna make a brand new Z-move for Lucario called Ultra Aura Sphere. He says, "Alright, Lucario, let's do it! Ultra Aura Sphere!" Destroying the Black Hole Eclipse with Persian as well, defeating it. He's like, "Alright, that was pretty fun." He heals up all his team, and Hao gives him the Lycanium Z, and he's like, "Alright, Lycanroc." So basically, he'd defeat most of the team, the Aether Foundation members, and once he reaches Lily, he's like, no, he doesn't, he says, "Lucario, Power Up Punch!" Lucario would Power Up Punch with all of his Pokemon with black and white eyes, all scaring Lusamine. He's like, and they're like, because they were actually good friends to Lily. Lily always gave them Pokepuffs and all that crap. And all that good stuff. So they'd bust down the door. And he's like, "Lusamine? Why would you do that?" And she's like, So she would teleport out of there and then go to the secret lab. Immediately, she'd go crazy and she'd want to battle Christian. And he's like, okay, this is a pretty good battle. This might be a little tricky. Let's try it. Let's go. Lycanroc. He'd send out his Lycanroc and he's like, cool, a brand new Lycanroc form. He's like, Stone Edge. He'd Stone Edge at Hercuflable, immediately defeating it. And he's like, alright, next Pokemon please, Lusamine. And she says, you insolent brat. And she says, go, Mismagius. And he says, Accelerock, Accelecrunch. And she's like, what move is that? And he says, it's called Accelecrunch. I created that move to defeat ice and ghost types. It's pretty good. You move first, and you bite, and you use your strongest. And it knocks out Mismagius. And then he sweeps through her entire team, and then he says, alright, Incineroar, let's defeat this Lilligant! Molish! And then he says, no, I think something else is gonna come, so no. Darkest Lariat! He'd destroy it with Darkest Lariat, and then the Ultra Beast shows up, and he's like, Gladion, let's double team it! How? You want a triple team? And How goes, yeah! So then he'd say, alright, here we go! And How would say, Decidueye! And Gladion would say, no! He'd say, Lycanroc! He'd say, let's go! And then he'd say, Malicious Moonsault! And he'd say, Sinister Arrow Raid! And he's like, alright, this is pretty good. And then he'd say, Sinister Arrow Raid! And he'd say, Continental Crush! And then they'd defeat the Ultra Beast, sending it, but then Lusamine would just walk in the Ultra Room Pro, going towards, trying to catch Necrozma. Oh yeah, I haven't been including the Ultra Recon Squad because they're just annoying. So basically, we'd be moving on to the next fight, which is them. Well, they go to the Pony Island, and Christian has an idea to get Lusamine back. The power of Zeraora could probably get us there in an instant. He lies. He doesn't actually say that. No. I want to say that for something else. He'd say, pretty sure the power of Solgaleo and Lunala would pretty much work. So Christian would get a Master Ball and a Sun Flute and a Moon Flute, and they'd head all the way, all four of them head to Pony Island looking for the Kahuna. And of course, Hapu's not there's no Kahuna, so then when Hapu becomes it, blah blah blah. Now moving on to the trial. No, he's gonna walk up. So he walks up and he says, alright, where is it? So moving on to the Vast Pony Canyon, they all sweep through the Vast Pony Canyon. Let me get some levels. Christian's entire team is like a level 55 to 54. Pretty good. He'd say, alright, time for the trial. You guys ready? They'd all send out their strongest Pokemon. Christian wouldn't send out his strongest, he'd be like, alright, let's give some other Pokemon a chance. Go! Greninja! He'd go, and Hal's like, whoa, it evolved? And why is it black? I thought it was supposed to be blue. He's like, well, it's a special Greninja. He's like, cool. Says, want to see our new form? And he's like, save that for the battle, guys. And he's like, alright, let's go. So when Totem, they all send out their Pokemon. Lily actually stepping in with Snowy. And he's like, alright guys, you ready? I taught Greninja a brand new move. And he's like, what did you teach it? And he's like, you'll see. Alright, Greninja, Battle Bond! So he'd immediately go into Battle Bond. And he's like, cool. He's like, alright, the Totem's here. Komo jumps down. Honestly, I think Komodo would have killed Tauros if he jumped down on Tauros. That would probably kill him, because that thing is gigantic. So basically, the Totem comes in, he's like, alright Gladion, you can strike him. He says, alright, Silvally, Crush Claw. He says, multi-attack. It's a normal type multi-attack. He'd slash right through him and say, poof. He's like, good job everyone. And then he'd say, Gladion, use a fairy memory, quickly! And then he'd also say, Lily, can you put some ice on the floor? And she's like, okay, Snowy, powder snow! And then she'd be like, Vulpix! Hey, didn't you realize how in Ninja Storm 4, the tail beasts are so tiny? Like, literally, these things are tiny. Like, they're not even bigger than a building. Yet, Kurama's like giant could literally sleep on the Hidden Leaf Village like a bed, and it would fit him perfectly. Whatever, back to the what if. So he'd immediately activate. So immediately he'd use a fairy member, and Christian would say, "This is my ultimate. This is our new move, Greninja Ice Beam." And Greninja would cup his hands like he's using a Kamehameha, but he'd be like, "Ice Beam, boom!" Freezing the cologne. He's like, "Gladion now!" He'd multi-attack, and then he'd say, "How? Use your C move." He said, "Spirit Arrow, Sinister Arrow, Rain," and they defeat him. So yeah, that's pretty much it for that fight. And they'd head to the summit. Pretty much what they'd do. It's pretty much all they'd do. So they'd head straight for the summit, and once they do, they summon Solgaleo. Oh yeah, they also went to Executor Island to go get it. Just saying, I don't feel like... So when he does, they summon Solgaleo. Then Solgaleo's captured, and out of nowhere. So when Solgaleo's taken, they're all like, "No!" But then out of nowhere, Zeraora comes and blitzes over. I'm kidding. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say that. I didn't mean to say Zeraora comes. So basically, Christian, Gladion, and Hal would head all over to go get Lusamine. But then Lusamine gets spat out. So basically, when they walk in, they're like, "Alright guys, you ready?" They'd all walk in, and they'd say, "Let's go." So immediately when they come, they immediately start fighting the guy, and they immediately start fighting him. They're like, "Shoot, we're not even close to being strong enough." They all send out every single one of their Pokemon, and they're all ready to battle. They go after Ultra Necrozma, but it isn't working. None of their attacks are working. They're like, "Shoot, what can we do?" Then out of nowhere, Christian hears a... I don't really know how to do the cry. He hears a... Zeraora! And he hears a Thunder Punch punching the Necrozma, sending it flying, and he's like, oh, and Zeraora appears. He's like, "Zeraora! I knew you'd come one day." And Zeraora would just look with a smile and say, and go, "Zera!" And then Christian says, "Alright everyone, let's go!" He say, "Here we go at full power, everyone, Z moves! Gladion, you might want to use the Fairy NEMZ, I don't think you have it, but use any Z move you have." He says, "Alright everyone, Z move!" They say, "Sinister, Malicious, Continental, Moonsault!" And they destroy him. They defeat him and get Solgaleo back. Right for the time where the league is created. But right before they leave, Christian is offered a Poipole. And then Zeraora appears. And he wants to be in he wants to join Christian's team. So then he puts Zeraora in a Pokeball, then takes it out, and he's like, "Yes, my dream has came true!" And then Zeraora is now on his team, and then Poipole comes, and he's like, "So how do I evolve it? I'm pretty sure you can evolve it." And then they say, "You can evolve it by teaching it Dragon Pulse." And he's like, "Dragon Pulse? Alright." So he heads up Mount Lanakila. Now let me give you a quick team recap. This is the full team right now. It is Incineroar, Dusk Lycanroc. Yeah, I know I'd say I did this in second part, but I don't really care. So it's Dusk Lycanroc. It's Incineroar, Dusk Lycanroc, Lucario. Oh, what else do I have? What else does he have? So Lucario, Dusk Lycanroc, Greninja, Incineroar, Zeraora, and Poipole. So he gets both of them, and he's like, "Alright, the team is filled." So he walks up Mount Lanakila, and then Poipole randomly starts evolving into Naganadel, and he's like, Naganadel, and he's like, "Yes!" So then he trains up the team. He trains up Poipole super hard. And then they go to their grand trial. He goes to his grand trial, and he's like, "Alright, Hapu, you ready?" And she says, "What can you do?" And he's like, "Alright, Greninja, let's go!" He'd throw out Greninja, and Greninja would they'd immediately go battle on and wreck Hapu's team. And then he moves on to the Elite Four. So when he makes it, he makes it to the top immediately, and having won that, he has a battle at the bottom with Gladion, and then immediately starts off, and Gladion says, "Let's go! Go, Silvally!" And he'd say, "So you want to use a legendary? I'll use one too! Go, Zeraora! Well, Zeraora's a mythical! He'd send out Zeraora, saying, "Alright, let's go, Gladion!" So Zeraora and Silvally would go at it, and he'd say, "Alright, let's see what moves you got." And he's like, "Whoa, those are awesome moves." So he knows he doesn't actually know anything. He knows Thunder Punch, Close Combat, Power Up Punch, and he doesn't want to say it, and he's like, "Alright, Gladion, you ready?" And he says, "Alright, Close Combat!" He started beating down on Silvally, beating him back. Then he'd say, "Multi-attack!" Hitting Zeraora back a little bit, and he says, "Zeraora, let's use your ultimate move, Plasma Fist!" His hand would start shaking with lightning, with plasma, and slamming them into the ground, zapping and defeating his whole team. He's like, "Yeah, we did it, Zeraora!" Boom! And Lucario, Incineroar, Lucario, and Lycanroc are all cheering on, saying, "Yeah!" So next fight is the How battle, and he says, "You can't really participate in this, Zeraora, because I want to do this battle with the Pokemon that I used my entire journey. Alright?" And Zeraora agrees, and he's like, "Alright." He's like, "Zah!" So when the battle starts, he immediately sends out his Vaporeon, and Christian says, "Good! Go, Poipole! Go, Naganadel!" He'd say, "Alright, Poison Jab!" He'd start fighting, these two would start fighting, and it ends up in a tie. Wait, no, I forgot the Ultra event. He doesn't battle How. So basically, he'd walk to the Elite Four. His team is awesome. He's like, "Alright, I can do this. He walks in, and then goes and starts to fight, and goes off with Hala. No, it wasn't Hala. Goes after Molayne, and Incineroar defeats it easily. Then Olivia, Lucario defeats her. Lucario and Greninja defeat her, mostly Greninja. The Dark type, Incineroar and Greninja got this. The flying one, Lucario's got it. People are like, "How has Lucario got it?" I'm kidding. Lycanroc's got it. Now for the champion battle. It's Champion Christian versus Challenger How. The battle would immediately start off with an intense, high-paced fight. It'd say, "Go, Naganadel!" and throw it out. It says, "Alright, let's go!" So immediately start clashing, and it's Tauros versus Naganadel. So we'd start off and say, "Dragon Pulse! Naganadel!" and hit it really hard. But then Tauros, How would say, "Take down Tauros!" Tauros would hit Naganadel really, really hard. And he's like, "Alright, well that's pretty good." And he says, "Eat this! Use Poison Jab!" He'd go and hit Tauros, sending it back, and then he said, "X-Scissor too!" Hitting him with X-Scissor. He's like, "Bop, bop!" beating Tauros badly, and he says, "Alright." And then with Naganadel speed, he just keeps on dodging and dodging. And he says, "Sledge Bomb! Take down!" He hits, and he's hit by a Batini Tauros rams toward. It hits Naganadel back, and he says, "Alright, X-Scissor, Naganadel!" And he hit it really, really hard. And they'd say, "That's pretty good." And he says, "Alright, use Dragon Pulse, pinpointed!" So immediately, he'd disappear from Tauros' vision and hit him with a hard Dragon Pulse, defeating it. Then Vaporeon would come and absolutely decimate it with Ice Beam. He'd say, "Ice Beam, Vaporeon!" And he'd just beam and defeat him. And then he'd say, "Alright, you want to play that game? Let's go! You're my next one, Lucario!" Then he'd say, "Alright, here we go, Lucario! Hadoran!" He'd shoot one Aura Sphere, hitting Vaporeon really hard. Then he'd say, "Power Up Punch!" Then he'd say also, after that, "Metal Claw!" And then he'd say, "Metal Sphere!" He'd create Metal Claws, and then create an Aura Sphere, and he'd shoot it towards, hitting really, really hard against Vaporeon, defeating it immediately. He says, "This is so much fun, How! bring more. So then he'd say, go Flareon. No, he wouldn't say go Flareon. He'd say, go Noivern. And then go. Now these two would end in a tie, but they actually wouldn't. Lucario would. He'd say, return, Lucario. He'd say, all right, you ready? Go. Let's go, Greninja. He'd send out Greninja and say, let's go, Greninja, Battle Bond. He'd immediately go Battle Bond and they'd start clashing with Noivern. Then he'd say, come on, let's finish it, Aerial Ace. He'd say, Greninja. Defeating Noivern. And then his next Pokemon, he says, alright, Christian, this one's one of my strongest. He says, this one actually is my strongest. It says, go, Decidueye. So immediately Decidueye would come out, and he's like, alright, this is the strong one. So immediately he'd say, Greninja, cut. He'd go for the cut, but it doesn't affect it. He's like, dang it, I completely forgot. And then Hal would say, Leaf Blade, cutting right to Greninja, one-shotting, and he's like, Greninja, no. And he's like, yeah, Decidueye. And he'd say, alright, let's do it. Sending out my next Pokemon, Lycanroc. And he'd say, return, go, Toucannon. Hal would send out his Toucannon, and they'd start going at it. Now, I don't remember Hal's team at all, so I'm just going to make up random Pokemon. He'd say, Toucannon, go. And he's like, this is not a good match. And they'd say, Accelecrunch. And then he'd hit it really hard. And they'd say, alright. And then Hal would say, Beak Blast, hitting Lycanroc really hard. And then he'd say, fly behind it and use Brick Break. He'd do, and Lycanroc is sent flying back. He's like, roar! Then he'd say, Stone Edge, hit it really hard, defeating it. And then he'd say, Beak Blast. These two would clash. And then Christian would say, go, use Accelerock. He'd run and ram into him, sending him back flying. And he'd say, alright, here we go. Use your best move. Lycanroc, Stone Edge again. So these two would clash, and they'd both hit each other. Lycanroc Stone Edge would break through the Beak Blast, but the Beak Blast would also break through. They both hit each other, knocking each other out. And he's like, wow, just awesome, Hal. Just awesome. And he'd say, let's bring out my next one. This is my starter. My ace, Incineroar. He'd throw it out, and then Incineroar with a blaze of glory would just come out and say, Rah! And then he'd say, let's go, Hal. These two would start clashing with, and then they start keeping, and then the Ultra Instinct music would play, fight, 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 Mahude, da, 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 umi, adi, oh, tomorrow. And then the Decidueye would activate its Overgrow ability, and he'd say, let's go, and Incineroar would go, blaze. These two would start clashing even more. Then he'd say, Incineroar, don't you think it's time to end this? End this clash between these two? Then he's like, yeah. And he says, alright, here we go with full power. And then a ring would show up, and he says, alright, Decidueye, the Quiet Forest. Then he says, Sinister Arrow Raid. And then he'd say, Malicious Moonsault. So Decidueye would go, and Incineroar would dodge all its hits. Not with ease, but with struggle. And then when Decidueye runs right into the ring, he says, now, Malicious Moonsault. And then he'd say, Decidueye, Sinister Arrow Raid, once more. These two would clash, doing a giant explosion on the Pokemon League. And then they'd both get sent flying, with Decidueye ramming into Hal, and Decidueye knocking Hal down, and Incineroar knocking Christian down, knocking them both down. They're like, we did it! So both of them would be knocked down. They're like, what's Hal's fifth Pokemon? He's like, and then Tapu Koko would come and want to battle with Hal. And he's like, you want to battle with me, Tapu Koko? So he says, let's go, Tapu Koko. And he says, the Pokemon that I've wanted for dreams, days upon days. Go, Zeraora! And then he'd go, Cha! And then he'd say, alright, Zeraora, you ready? So then immediately Starmie says, and Hal would say, nature's madness! And then Christian would say, alright, let's go! Let's start off with an iron claw, with a metal claw. I'm pretty sure Zeraora can't learn this, so screw it. And then he'd hit, and then these two would clash, but Nature's Madness would eventually win that clash. He's like, alright, this is how it's gonna be. Then I guess we're gonna have to do this the hard way. And then he'd say, alright, Plasma Fists! And then he'd slam him into the ground, hitting Tapu Koko for a lot of damage. He's like, alright, close combat! And then he says, Nature's Madness! And they would clash. Boom! And then he'd say, alright, Discharge! That's what Hal would say. And then he's like, and then Zero would immediately get back up and go, and then he'd go even faster. And Hal's like, what? And he says, Volt Absorb, Hal, Volt Absorb. He'd glitch over and say, Power Punch! Boom! Breaking Tapu Koko a little bit, and then he says, Plasma Fist! But then when Zero was about to slam him, Zero stops and says, I want to do this better. So then he starts clashing the fists. Starts hitting him with the fists and saying, wow, Zeraora's using Plasma Fist as a combat move. He's like, cool. And he says, Zeraora, Thunder Punch! And then Zeraora punching it back. He says, alright, Hal, it's time. Hal would put in the Z crystal, and Tapu Koko restores their Z stuff, creating this. And then he says, Island, Guardian of Alola. And Christian would say, here we go. What the? And he says, huh? He says, it's a Zeraorium Z. Zeraorium Z. Secret move, Ultimate Plasma Fists. This move is so strong, Zeraora slams its fist into the ground. Actually, Zeraora does not slam its fist in the ground. Zeraora jumps up into the air and starts pummeling its opponent and uses these as giant fists to punch against the ground. To punch against its opponent. He's like, and then, nah, I'm kidding, guys, it's not Zeraorium Z. He uses Zeraorium Z, and then he says 10 million volt, and then he says, let's go! Zeraora! Say, alright, Zeraora, 10 million volt Thunderbolt! 10 million volt Plasma Bolt! Ah! And these two would clash, and he'd say, and then he'd say, Zeraora! Let's use the Zeraorium Z, the true one! Ultimate Plasma Fists! Ah! And punch right through the aisle, and then he said, close! Plasma Fist! Combat! And he started pummeling him, and saying, now the final blow! Ah! And clawing and punching Tapu Koko in the stomach and saying, ultimate move! And then he'd kick him down and say, Plasma Fists! And punch the ground, immediately defeating Tapu Koko. Christian is the new champion and the strongest electric type trainer. I'm kidding. And that, guys, is the end of part 2.